He had two choices: ride on or ruin his life. The sun didn't just shine in Arizona, it beat down, trying to hammer the life out of everything that moved. And Jackson Cole was a man who understood that. He understood that you look out for your own, you keep your head down, and you don't go looking for trouble. Because trouble, out here, had a way of finding you anyway. He saw the flicker of red in the river first. Not much, just a whisper of color in the churning brown water. But it was enough. He pulled his horse, Dusty, to a halt, the leather creaking in the oppressive silence. He squinted, his eyes tracing the stain upstream. And then he saw her, an Apache woman face down in the shallows. Her black hair fanned out around her head like a dark halo. Her buckskin dress was torn, the intricate beadwork dulled by mud and something darker. Her leg was twisted at an angle that made his own bones ache. She was still breathing, just barely. The shallow rise and fall of her back was the only thing that separated her from a corpse. Jackson's first thought was simple and brutal. Ride on. This wasn't his fight. This was the kind of trouble that didn't just knock on your door. It kicked the door down and set the whole house on fire. Bringing an Apache, a wounded one at that, back to his ranch, it was a death sentence. Maybe not for him, not right away, but for the quiet, fragile peace he tried to build from the ashes of his life. The folks in Prescott, they had long memories and short tempers. They wouldn't see a woman in need. They'd see an enemy, an excuse. He thought of his daughter, Sarah, 12 years old and as silent as a stone. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since the accident. She just sat at the dinner table, moving food around her plate with a tiny, worn-out doll clutched in her hand. Her eyes were old, full of ghosts. He couldn't fight for her. He could ride on. He could be home by sundown. He could sit across from Sarah in that heavy silence and pretend he hadn't seen. He could let the desert do what the desert does. But then another memory hit him. His wife, Mary, laughing right here on this very riverbank, her face tilted up to the sun, her hand in his, a life ago, before the silence, before the ghosts. He looked back at the woman in the water, and he knew. Riding on wasn't a choice. It was a betrayal. Jackson swung down from Dusty, his boots sinking into the wet sand. The water was cool against his ankles. He slid his arms under her. She was lighter than he expected, and burning with fever. Every ragged breath she took sounded like a tiny shard of glass in her lungs. He lifted her, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her skin was hot, dry, desperate. As he turned back toward his horse, he wasn't just carrying a dying woman. He was carrying the storm, bringing it home with him, and he had no idea if they would survive it. The ride back was a special kind of hell. The woman, whose name he didn't know, drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes moaning a word in a language he didn't understand. He had her propped in front of him on the saddle, her weight a constant, burning reminder of the choice he'd made. Every jostle of the horse seemed to pull a fresh wave of pain from her. When his small, dusty ranch finally came into view, he felt a knot in his stomach tighten. This was his sanctuary, the one place in the world he'd managed to keep safe, and he was about to invite the wolves right to the door. Sarah was on the porch where she always was, waiting. She was barefoot, her dress dusty, that faceless doll held tight against her chest. When she saw what he was carrying, her eyes went wide. Not with fear, not with surprise. It was something else. A flicker of recognition? No, that couldn't be right. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "fetch the clean blankets from the chest and boil water. Now." She didn't move for a second. Her eyes were fixed on the unconscious woman's face. Then she turned without a word and slipped inside the cabin. The screen door slammed shut behind her, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet afternoon. Jackson carried the woman inside and laid her on his own bed. It was the only one big enough, the only one strong enough. The small room, usually so empty, suddenly felt crowded, suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of river water, sweat, and blood. Her breathing was a ragged, painful rhythm that seemed to count down the seconds she had left. He wasn't a doctor. He was a rancher and a former soldier. He knew how to set a fence post and how to sight a rifle. He knew how to stop a bleed, at least long enough to matter. He found the wound in her side, a nasty, deep gash caked with dried blood and dirt. He cleaned it as best he could with boiled water and whiskey, his hands surprisingly steady. She didn't even flinch. She was too far gone. He splinted her broken leg with 2 pieces of firewood and strips torn from their own bedsheets. All the while he could feel Sarah's eyes on him from the corner of the room. She stood there, a small, silent shadow clutching that doll. He couldn't read her expression. Was it accusation? Fear? Or just the same empty stillness she'd worn for 5 long years? Days bled into one another. The rhythm of the ranch became a tense, 3-part harmony. Jackson would tend the cattle in the blistering morning sun, his mind constantly drifting back to the cabin. He'd come in to check on the woman, change her bandages, and try to get her to drink a little water. He'd make lunch for Sarah, who ate in her usual silence. Then at night, he'd sit by the bed, listening to that ragged breathing, wondering if each breath would be her last. The woman never spoke. A few times her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, sharp, and full of a fire that hadn't been quenched. She would look at him, not with gratitude but with an intense, unnerving scrutiny, like she was measuring his soul. Then her eyes would close, and she'd be gone again. Jackson started talking to her, not expecting an answer. He just needed to fill the silence. He told her about the ranch, about the stubborn cow that kept finding holes in the fence, about the way the sky looked just before a storm. He told her about Mary. He even tried to tell her about Sarah, but the words got stuck in his throat. One afternoon, about a week in, something changed. The fever had broken the night before. Her breathing was still shallow, but it was steady. The frantic heat had left her skin. Jackson was outside mending a leather strap when he heard a faint sound from the cabin. Not a voice, a scratching. He walked to the door and peered inside. The woman was sitting up, propped against the pillows. She looked frail, but her eyes were clear. In one hand, she held a small pocket knife from his bedside table. In the other, a piece of kindling from the wood box. And Sarah was there, not in the corner, but standing right beside the bed, closer than she'd been to the woman this whole time. She was watching, mesmerized, as the woman's weak hands worked the wood. Slowly, methodically, a shape was emerging from the small block of pine. Shavings fell onto the blanket like sawdust snow. Jackson stayed silent, not wanting to break the spell. The only sounds were the scrape of the knife and the whisper of the wind outside. It was a bird, a hawk maybe. Its wings were spread wide, its head tilted, as if it were listening to some distant call. The detail was incredible. Each feather seemed to be carved with a purpose. When she was finished, the woman held it out. Not to him, to Sarah. Sarah hesitated for only a moment. Then her small, dirt-smudged hand reached out and took the wooden bird. She turned it over and over, her thumb tracing the smooth, flowing lines of the wings. And then it happened. A smile. Not a twitch of the lips. Not a ghost of an expression. A real, honest-to-God smile spread across Sarah's face, lighting up her eyes. It was like seeing the sun rise after a 5-year night. Jackson felt the air leave his lungs. He hadn't seen that smile since the day before Mary died. The woman on the bed watched Sarah, and for the first time, the hardness in her eyes softened. A flicker of warmth. A shared moment that needed no words. Something fundamental had shifted in that little cabin. The silence was still there, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something. Hope, maybe. Jackson still didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from or what she was running from. But as he watched his daughter finally smile, he knew one thing for sure. The storm had already arrived. And maybe, just maybe, it was here to wash away the ghosts. But out in the desert, storms don't just bring rain. They bring lightning. And Jackson had a feeling the first strike was coming soon. He looked out the window toward the distant ridge, and a shiver went down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening chill. He felt like they were being watched. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. It clung to the air like the heat itself. Jackson found himself scanning the horizon more often, his hand resting near the Winchester he now kept propped by the door. The peace that had settled inside the cabin felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark river. The woman began to heal. She still couldn't walk on her own, but she could sit up for hours, her hands always busy. She showed Sarah how to weave tight, beautiful patterns into baskets from river reeds. She taught her, through gestures and soft sounds, which plants in the garden were for eating and which were for medicine. One evening she finally spoke to him. Her voice was quiet, raspy from disuse. "Nayeli," she said, touching her own chest. "Jackson," he replied, pointing to himself. He gestured to Sarah. "Sarah." Nayeli smiled faintly. The name felt like a key, unlocking a door that had been sealed shut. But what was behind that door was still a mystery. And Jackson was starting to suspect it was a mystery that other people wanted to solve. The supplies were running low. The flour sack was nearly empty, and the coffee was down to its last bitter grounds. It was time for a trip to Prescott. Jackson hated the idea of leaving Nayeli and Sarah alone, but he hated the idea of them going hungry even more. When he told Nayeli he was going to town, she looked at him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Then, using a chair for support, she stood up. She was unsteady, but her resolve was like iron. She said she was coming with him. He tried to argue. He told her it was dangerous, that people in town wouldn't be welcoming. He tried to explain the kind of hate that festered in a place like Prescott. She just shook her head, her gaze unwavering. It was clear she wasn't asking for permission. Then Sarah piped up, her voice small but clear. "I want to go too." It was the most she'd said in a week. Jackson looked from his daughter's determined face to Nayeli's stubborn one, and he knew he was outnumbered. He felt a surge of dread, but also a strange, unfamiliar flicker of pride. They were a unit, a strange, broken, little unit. And so Jackson found himself driving his wagon into the lion's den with a silent, determined girl and a recovering Apache woman who looked at the world like she was ready for a fight. Prescott was just as he remembered, a dusty, sun-baked artery of sin and commerce. The smell of cheap whiskey, horse manure, and sweat hung in the air. Men in wide-brimmed hats watched them from the shade of the saloon porch, their eyes lingering on Nayeli. The whispers started before they even tied up the horses. They walked into Henderson's general store, and the quiet chatter inside died instantly. It was like they'd walked into a church in the middle of a sermon. Every eye was on them. Henderson, a balding man with nervous eyes, just nodded curtly at Jackson and tried to pretend he didn't see Nayeli. As Jackson listed off his supplies, he could feel the weight of the stairs. He heard a low chuckle from the back of the store. He didn't have to look to know who it was. Cole Harding. Harding was a big man who owned the biggest ranch in the county, and he acted like he owned the county too. He was built like a bull, with a mean streak as wide as the Verde River. He and his men were lounging by the pickle barrel, their grins dripping with malice. Jackson ignored them. He paid Henderson, loaded the sacks of flour and sugar, the tins of coffee and beans. He just wanted to get his family, and that word popped into his head uninvited, out of there. They were tying the last of the supplies onto the wagon when Harding and his three cronies swaggered out of the store. They blocked his path, their shadows stretching long and ugly in the afternoon sun. "Well now, Cole," Harding said, his voice a low drawl that grated on Jackson's nerves. He wasn't looking at Jackson. His eyes, small and dark like a pig's, were locked on Nayeli. "Look what the river washed up. Thought we'd gotten rid of all you folk." Jackson stepped between them. "We're leaving, Harding. Get out of the way." Harding laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I don't think so. You see, you've got something that don't belong to you." His eyes flickered from Nayeli to the wagon, then back again. "Something that belongs to me." What was he talking about? He couldn't just mean Nayeli. It was something more, something specific. "The only thing I've got is my property and my family," Jackson said, his voice dangerously low. "Now move." Harding took a step closer, crowding him. The smell of stale whiskey rolled off him in waves. "Family? That's what you call it?" He spat on the ground, just inches from Jackson's boot. "You bring that filth onto your land, you're going to find out what happens to trash." One of his men reached out and made a grab for Nayeli's arm. Before Jackson could even move, Nayeli reacted. She didn't scream or flinch. She moved with a speed that defied her injuries. She grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it with a sharp, brutal efficiency, and used his own momentum to slam him into the side of the wagon. The man yelped, clutching his arm, his face a mask of shock and pain. Harding's grin vanished. His face turned a mottled red. The street had gone dead silent. Everyone was watching. It was the kind of standoff that ends in one of two ways, with words or with blood. And Jackson knew Harding wasn't a man for words. He could see the fury in Harding's eyes, the twitch in his hand as it hovered near the pistol on his hip. But then, a small hand slipped into his. It was Sarah. She was standing right beside him, her small frame rigid, her eyes fixed on Harding, with a cold fire he'd never seen in her before. She wasn't scared, she was angry. Her presence seemed to change the equation. Shooting a man in the street was one thing. Doing it in front of his little girl? Even for a man like Harding, it was a line he wasn't ready to cross. Not yet. He glared at Jackson, then at Nayeli, his eyes full of venomous promise. "This ain't over, Cole," he hissed. "I'll be coming for what's mine." He turned and stormed back toward the saloon, his men scrambling after him. As Jackson helped Nayeli and Sarah onto the wagon, the ride home felt different. The air wasn't filled with dread anymore. It was filled with a low, humming tension, a declaration of war. Sarah sat between them, and for the first time on the whole trip, she reached out and took Nayeli's hand. Jackson saw the small gesture, and he realized Harding was right about one thing. This wasn't just about a woman he'd found in a river anymore. This was about his family, and he would burn the whole world down to keep them safe. But as the ranch came into view, a new, cold thought crept into his mind. Harding had said, "I'll be coming for what's mine." He hadn't just been talking about Nayeli. He was talking about something she had. What in God's name had he brought into his home? The quiet that followed their trip to Prescott was heavier, more watchful. Jackson worked his chores with one eye on the horizon, the Winchester never more than an arm's length away. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Inside the cabin, things were different. The space that once felt haunted by silence was now filled with a low hum of life. Nellie, now moving with a slight limp but without the need for a crutch, taught Sarah how to grind corn into fine flour. They would sit for hours, Nayeli humming a soft, rhythmic tune, Sarah listening intently, her hands covered in white dust. The wooden bird Nayeli had carved now sat on the mantelpiece, a silent guardian. One evening, Jackson picked it up, admiring the craftsmanship. As he turned it over, his thumb brushed against the underside of the wing. He felt a groove, an unnatural line in the smooth wood. He looked closer. They weren't just random scratches. They were symbols, tiny, precise markings, almost invisible unless you were looking for them. They looked like a map, a trail. He looked over at Nayeli, who was watching him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held a new weight. She knew what he'd found. Before he could ask, the dog started barking. It wasn't a friendly bark. It was a frantic, ragged sound of alarm. Jackson grabbed the Winchester and moved to the door, his heart hammering in his chest. He saw the dust first, a plume rising from the ridge, dark against the setting sun. 4 riders moving fast. He didn't need a spyglass to know who was in the lead. Cole Harding. "Nayeli, get Sarah in the cellar," he ordered, his voice flat and cold. But Nellie didn't move. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace, her knuckles white. "No," she said, her voice low and fierce. "We do not run." Sarah surprisingly didn't run either. She stood behind Nayeli, her small face pale but her jaw set. She looked exactly like her mother did when she was angry. Harding and his men pulled up just beyond the well, forming a semicircle, trapping them. Harding's smile was a slash of ugly confidence in his flushed face. "Evening, Cole," he called out, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "I told you I'd be back. Came to collect my property." "You're trespassing, Harding," Jackson yelled back, the rifle resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. "Last chance to turn around and ride out of here with your skin intact." Harding laughed. "I don't want your scrub brush ranch, Cole. I want what your squaw stole from me." He pointed a thick finger at Nayeli. "She has something of mine, a small leather pouch. Hand it over, and we'll be on our way." A pouch? Jackson's mind raced. He'd never seen a pouch. He glanced at Nayeli. Her face was a mask of stone. but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear? No. Defiance. I don't know what you're talking about, Jackson said, stalling for time, trying to figure out the angles. 4 of them. 1 of him. Bad odds. Don't lie to me, Harding roared, his face darkening. My man saw her with it before she gave him the slip at the river. A map, to the old Spanish silver. A map. The carvings on the bird. It all clicked into place. This wasn't about hate, it was about greed. Nellie wasn't just a refugee. She was a treasure hunter, or a guardian of some secret. The attack at the river, it wasn't random. They were hunting her. One of Harding's men, a jittery man with a scarred face, grew impatient. He unholstered his pistol. Let's just take 'em, Cole. We can find it after they're dead. The air grew thick. The world seemed to shrink to the space between the porch and the riders. This was it. The moment it all went to hell. And that's when Sarah moved. She stepped out from behind Nayeli, planting her small feet firmly on the porch boards. She pointed a trembling finger at the man with the drawn pistol, and she screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror. It was a raw, piercing shriek of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the sound of 5 years of silent grief and anger exploding out of her. The sound was so sudden, so primal, it stunned everyone into silence. The riders' horses shied, spooked by the noise. Harding flinched. The man with the pistol actually took a step back. It was only a second's hesitation, but it was all Jackson needed. He lifted the Winchester, sighted down the barrel, and fired. Not at Harding, not at any of the men. He aimed at the top of the well's wooden frame, just inches from Harding's head. The crack of the rifle shot split the air. Wood splintered and exploded. Harding's men ducked, their bravado evaporating in the face of cold, calculated precision. They looked at Jackson then, and they didn't see a desperate rancher. They saw a soldier. They saw a man who knew how to kill, who had just demonstrated that he could put a bullet exactly where he wanted it to go. And the next one wouldn't be a warning. Harding's face was white. The smirk was gone. He stared at Jackson, then at the screaming girl, then at the Apache woman holding an iron poker like a war club. He had miscalculated. He thought he was coming for a broken man. He'd found a fortress. With a snarled curse, he yanked on his horse's reins, wheeling it around. This changes nothing, he yelled over his shoulder as he galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. Jackson kept the rifle trained on them until they were just specks of dust on the horizon. He slowly lowered the barrel, his shoulder aching. The silence they left behind was deafening. He turned. Sarah had finally stopped screaming. She was breathing in ragged gas, her whole body trembling. Nally put a hand on her shoulder, murmuring something soft and low. As Harding's men had wheeled around to flee, one of them had dropped something. A small, dark object lay in the dust near the well. Jackson walked over and picked it up. It was a piece of rawhide, old and worn. Stamped into it was a symbol, a stylized hawk, wings spread wide. It was the exact same symbol carved into the bottom of the wooden bird on his mantelpiece. Harding didn't just know about the map. He had a piece of it. That night, the truth came out. They sat at the small kitchen table, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The wooden bird and the rawhide patch lay between them. Sarah sat close to Nayeli, her head leaning against the woman's arm, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The map, Jackson said, his voice quiet. It's a map to a silver mine, like he said? Nellie nodded slowly. Not just a mine. It is a sacred place, a place where the silver is a gift from the spirits, not a treasure to be stolen. My people have guarded it for generations. She told him the story. Her family were the keepers of the 2 halves of the map. One half was carved into a talisman, a bird passed down through the generations. The other half was on a leather chart. Harding, who had worked as an army scout years ago, had learned of the legend. He became obsessed. He came to our camp, Nellie said, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes dark with the memory. He and his men, they were not there to talk. They wanted the map. My father, my brother. They fought to protect it. She closed her eyes. I ran. I had the bird. They got the leather. They shot me as I jumped into the river. So Harding had one half, and she had the other. Neither was useful without its counterpart. That's why he was so desperate. That's why he hadn't just killed her in town. He needed her, or at least the carving she protected. He will be back, Jackson stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, Naomi said. He will not stop. Not until he has it all. A heavy silence fell over them. The weight of what they were up against settled in the small room. Harding had money, men, and the town in his pocket. Jackson had a rundown ranch, a healing woman, a traumatized girl, and one rifle. We have to leave, Jackson said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. We can pack the wagon, ride north, disappear. Nellie looked at him. And what then? Run forever? Let him win? Let him desecrate a sacred place for his greed? She shook her head. I have run enough. My family died so this map would not be whole. I will not let their sacrifice be for nothing. She looked over at Sarah, who had fallen asleep against her. And this is your home. This is her home. A home should be fought for. Jackson looked at his daughter, her face peaceful in sleep for the first time in years. He looked at the cabin, the walls that held the only good memories he had left of his wife. He thought of Harding's smug, cruel face. Nellie was right. Running wasn't a solution. It was just a slower death. All right, he said, a new hardness in his voice. We don't run, we fight. But how? How could three people stand against a man who owned the whole valley? He needed help. He needed the law. The next morning he rode into Prescott alone. He left Naomi and Sarah at the ranch, hidden, with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone. The sheriff's office was a small, dusty room that smelled of stale coffee and regret. Sheriff Miller was a man well past his prime, with a belly that spilled over his gun belt and eyes that had seen too much and done too little. Jackson laid it all out. Harding's attack on the ranch, the story of the map, the threat to Naomi's life. He told him everything. Sheriff Miller listened, rubbing his tired face. When Jackson was done, the sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound. Jackson, he said, you know who Cole Harding is. He's got half the town on his payroll. The judge plays poker with him every Tuesday. You're asking me to go to war with a man I can't beat. So you're not going to do anything? Jackson asked, disbelief turning to cold anger. My advice? Give him what he wants, the sheriff said, refusing to meet Jackson's eyes. It's just a map. Your girl's life is worth more than some Indian silver, ain't it? Jackson stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. Thanks for nothing, Sheriff. He walked out, the feeling of being utterly alone colder than any winter wind. The law wasn't coming. No one was coming. As he was untying his horse, a voice called out from the doorway of the general store. It was Henderson, the store owner. He was beckoning to him nervously. Jackson walked over. What is it, Henderson? I heard what happened at your place, Henderson whispered, glancing up and down the street. You need to be careful, Jackson. Harding's stirring up something fierce. He's telling everyone you're hiding a murderer, an Apache who killed a prospector upriver. That's a lie, Jackson said. Of course it is, Henderson said. But people are scared, and scared people are stupid. He's putting together a posse, not an official one. Just a bunch of his hired guns and some drunks from the saloon looking for a fight. A posse, a mob. They weren't just coming for the map anymore. They were coming to wipe him out. There's something else, Henderson said, his voice dropping even lower. Harding wasn't always a rancher. Years back, he was an Army scout. Got discharged. Dishonorably. They said he was too brutal, even for them. He led a raid on a peaceful Apache camp. A massacre. Looking for that silver even then. A cold dread washed over Jackson. This wasn't just about greed. This was an old, bloody obsession. He thanked Henderson and swung up onto Dusty's back. As he rode out of town, he felt the weight of 100 hostile eyes on him. The town was a powder keg, and Harding was holding the match. He was halfway home, pushing Dusty hard when he saw him. A lone rider sitting motionless on a bluff overlooking the trail. He was too far away to make out his features, but he wasn't one of Harding's men. He was Apache. The way he sat his horse, the way he blended into the landscape. He was a warrior, a scout. He was watching the ranch. Was he a friend of Naomi's? Or was he another enemy, come to reclaim the map for his own people? Jackson urged his horse faster. The world was closing in. Enemies in front of him, enemies behind him, and now a new unknown player watching from the hills. The storm was no longer on its way. It was here, and it was about to break right over their heads. When Jackson got back to the ranch, his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He burst into the cabin, rifle in hand. "There's a rider," he said, his voice tight. "An Apache scout. On the North Ridge. He's watching the house." Natalie went to the window, her face grim. She stared for a long moment, her eyes narrowed. "I know him," she said softly. "His name is Kyle. He was my brother's closest friend. He must have been tracking me." "Is he a friend?" Jackson asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "He is loyal to our people," Natalie answered, which wasn't an answer at all. "And to the sacred mine. He will want the map piece." Friend or foe, it didn't matter. They were trapped. Harding and his mob were coming from town, and now a skilled Apache warrior was watching their every move. They were caught in a vice. That evening, as dusk settled, turning the sky to bruised purple and orange, Cal came down from the ridge. He didn't ride up to the house. He simply appeared at the edge of the clearing, as silent as a ghost. He was tall and lean, his face a mask of hard lines and old sorrows. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows on his back, and a long knife at his hip. Jackson met him on the porch, Winchester held loosely at his side. Nellie stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel. Cale's eyes flickered from Jackson to Nellie, and a hint of relief softened his hard features. "They said you were dead," he said to her, his voice a low rumble. "I am not so easy to kill," Nellie replied. "Harding has the leather," Cale said. "His men are gathering in the town. They talk of fire and rope. You have the bird?" Nellie nodded. Cale's gaze shifted to Jackson. "And you, the white man who shelters a ghost. Why?" "It was the right thing to do," Jackson said simply. Cale studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to strip away every lie and pretense. "Honor is a rare thing in a man like you," he said, "not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact. But honor will not stop bullets." He looked back at Nellie. "Give me the bird. I will take it far from here. I will draw Harding away from this place. You and the girl will be safe." It was a way out, a chance. Jackson could feel the pull of it, the sweet relief of letting this burden go. But Nayeli shook her head. "No, we do not run. We finish this. Here." "You would fight a hornet's nest with a stick," Kyle argued. "They will overwhelm you." "Not if the hornets fly into a trap," Jackson said, an idea beginning to form in his mind. A desperate, crazy idea. He was a rancher, but he had been a soldier first. He knew tactics. He knew how to use terrain to his advantage. This ranch wasn't just his home. It was a battlefield he knew every inch of. The rocky creek bed, the dense thicket behind the barn, the narrow pass between the two hills. "Harding thinks he's coming for a scared farmer in a wooden box," Jackson said. The plan taking shape, the words coming faster. "We won't be in the box. We'll be waiting for him in the dark. We can use the narrow path by the creek to funnel them in. Set traps. An ambush." Cal listened, his head tilted, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "You are a soldier," he stated. "I was," Jackson said. "It is a good plan," Cal admitted. "For a soldier. But there are more than a dozen of them. There are 3 of us." He looked at Nayeli's leg. 2.5, at best. "There are 4 of us," a small voice said. They all turned. Sarah was standing there, her chin held high, that faceless doll clutched in her hand. "I can help," she said. Jackson started to object, to send her away where it was safe, but Nellie put a hand on his arm. "What can you do, little bird?" Nellie asked gently. "I'm small," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I can hide. I can watch. I can be the lookout. I know all the best hiding spots." Jackson looked at his daughter, and for the first time he didn't see a fragile, broken child. He saw a survivor. He saw a piece of her mother's steel. Cal looked from Sarah to Jackson to Niley. He saw their faces, their set jaws, the fire in their eyes. He saw a family forged in crisis, ready to make a stand. A long, slow smile touched his lips for the first time. 3.5, then, he said. The odds are better. I will fight with you. The alliance was made. The die was cast. They spent the rest of the night preparing. They weren't just defending a home anymore. They were setting a trap. They gathered rope, lanterns, and every round of ammunition Jackson had. Naeli, using her knowledge of the land, showed them where the ground was softest, best for pitfalls. Kyle, the silent hunter, moved like a phantom, choosing the best positions for an ambush. And Sarah was their eyes. She knew a small, hidden cave in the rocks overlooking the trail, a spot no one would ever think to look. From there, she could see the riders coming long before they reached the ranch. She would be their signal. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky, their work was done. The ranch was no longer a home. It was a kill box. They waited. The sun rose higher, the heat building. The silence was absolute, stretching their nerves to the breaking point. Then it came. A high, clear whistle from the rocks. The call of a meadowlark. It was Sarah's signal. They were coming. Jackson's blood ran cold. He checked his rifle one last time. He looked over at Kyle, who was melting into the shadows near the barn, bow in hand. He glanced toward the cabin, where Naeli was waiting with a heavy iron poker and a bucket of oil meant for a lantern, but repurposed for something far more dangerous. It was time. The final battle for their lives was about to begin, and the sun was climbing toward noon, ready to bear witness to whatever came next. The dust cloud on the horizon grew, resolving into a pack of riders. Jackson counted 12 of them. More than he'd feared. Harding was in the lead, riding with the arrogant certainty of a man who believes he has already won. They rode into the narrow creek pass, just as Jackson had predicted. It was the only direct approach to the ranch. The high, rocky sides forced them into a tight, single-file line, a perfect bottleneck. Jackson lay flat behind a cluster of boulders overlooking the pass, the warm metal of the Winchester pressed against his cheek. He waited. Patience was a weapon, and he had learned to wield it in the war. He waited until Harding and the first few men had cleared the narrowest point. He waited until they were fully committed, with no easy way to retreat. Then he gave the signal, a low whistle mimicking a hawk's cry. Kyle, hidden in the rocks on the opposite side, stood and drew his bow. The first arrow flew with a sound like tearing silk. It took the last man in the line through the throat. He toppled from his horse without a sound. Before the others could react, a second arrow struck the man in front of him. Panic erupted. The line broke as men yelled in confusion, trying to see where the attack was coming from. Their horses, spooked by the sudden chaos, began to buck and rear in the confined space. That was Jackson's cue. He sighted on a man who was drawing his pistol and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The man spun and fell. 2 down, 10 to go. "Ambush!" Harding roared, his face a mask of fury. "It's Cole! Spread out! Find him!" But there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. A few of the men tried to turn their horses around, creating a logjam of panicked flesh and steel. Jackson fired again, his shot ricocheting off the rock wall, sending stone shards flying and sowing more confusion. This was what he'd planned for. Chaos was his ally. Harding, to his credit, didn't panic. He was a brute, but he was a seasoned fighter. He dismounted, pulling his own rifle from his saddle. "Up the rocks!" he bellowed. "They're up in the rocks! Flush them out!" 3 of his men started scrambling up the rocky incline toward Jackson's position, firing wildly. Bullets whined past Jackson's head, chipping away at his cover. He was pinned. But this was also part of the plan. From the cabin, Nellie kicked open the door. In her hands was the bucket of lantern oil. With a powerful heave, she threw the contents across the dry porch steps and the patch of dead grass in front of the house, the area where Harding and his remaining men were trying to take cover. Before they could understand what she'd done, she struck a match and tossed it. The ground erupted in a wall of fire. It wasn't a large fire, but it was sudden and shocking. It blocked Harding's path to the cabin, forcing him and his men back toward the barn. Right where Kyle was waiting, arrows flew from the shadows. Another man went down, clutching his chest. Then another. Kyle was a specter, a silent dealer of death, moving from one patch of darkness to the next. The ambush had turned into a rout. The posse, a collection of hired guns and barroom bullies, had no stomach for a real fight. They had expected a single man, easily overwhelmed. Not a coordinated three-pronged attack from a soldier, a ghost, and a fire-wielding woman. Two of the remaining men scrambled onto their horses and fled back the way they came, not caring who they trampled. Now it was just Harding and two of his most loyal thugs. They were pinned down behind the water trough, using it for cover. "Cole!" Harding screamed, his voice raw with hate. "You're a dead man! You hear me? Dead!" Jackson knew he had to end this. He slid from his position and began to work his way down the rocks, moving from cover to cover, closing the distance. He caught a glimpse of Cale, slipping through the back door of the barn. They were herding Harding, driving him toward the final confrontation. Suddenly, one of Harding's men broke from cover, making a desperate run for the corral. Cale's bowstring sang one last time. The man fell face first into the dust. It was just Harding and one man left. Jackson was almost at ground level when he saw it. The last of Harding's men wasn't shooting at him or Cale. He was aiming his pistol up at the rocks, at the small, hidden cave. He was aiming at Sarah. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through Jackson. He screamed his daughter's name. He brought his rifle up, a frantic, desperate shot. He hit the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. But the man's finger tightened on the trigger as he fell. A single shot rang out, the bullet flying toward the cave. Time stopped. Jackson's world narrowed to that small, dark opening in the rock. He saw a flicker of movement, then silence. Rage, pure and blinding, consumed him. He vaulted over the last boulder and charged, not even thinking, just moving. He saw Harding, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer. Harding raised his rifle, aiming it squarely at Jackson's chest. It was over. He was too exposed, too close. But then, a blur of motion came from the side. Nayeli. She had circled around behind the trough, the iron poker held like a spear. She lunged, plunging the heavy iron point into Harding's side. Harding roared in pain and surprise, his shot going wide. He backhanded Nayeli, sending her sprawling. That was all the opening Jackson needed. He crashed into Harding like a freight train. The rifle flew from Harding's grasp. They fell to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. This wasn't a soldier's fight anymore. This was raw, brutal survival. Jackson rained punches down on Harding's face, fueled by the terror of what might have happened to Sarah. Harding was bigger, stronger, and he fought back with savage ferocity, his thumbs gouging for Jackson's eyes. They rolled in the dirt, the dust choking them. Harding got on top, his thick hands closing around Jackson's throat. Jackson's vision started to swim, black spots dancing in front of his eyes. "I should have killed you years ago," Harding rasped, his face inches from Jackson's. "I should have finished it the day your wife died." Jackson froze. The pressure on his throat seemed to disappear. "What did you say?" he choked out. Harding's cruel smile returned. "Oh, you didn't know? I was there, up on the ridge. I wasn't after her. I was tracking Nayeli's people, even back then. Started a rock slide to flush them out. Your wife, she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bad luck. The river, the rock slide, the accident that had stolen his wife and shattered his daughter's world. It wasn't an act of God. It was him. It had always been him." Something inside Jackson snapped. All the grief, all the anger, all the years of silent suffering coalesced into a single point of white-hot strength. With a roar that came from the very depths of his soul, he bucked, throwing Harding off him. He scrambled on top of Harding, his hands finding the man's throat. He squeezed, the rage giving him inhuman strength. Harding's face turned purple, his eyes bulging. He was going to kill him, right here, with his bare hands. "Pa!" The voice cut through his rage like a knife. He looked up. Sarah was standing on the rocks above, perfectly fine. The bullet had missed. She was looking down at him, her eyes wide with fear. Not fear of Harding, fear of him, of what he was about to become. He looked down at the man beneath him, gasping and clawing at his hands. He saw the faces of Nayeli, of Cale, of Sarah. Vengeance was a poison, and it would end up killing him too. With a shuddering breath, he let go. Harding gasped, sucking in air. Jackson stood up, trembling, and picked up his rifle. He pointed it at Harding's chest. It was over. Just then, a lone rider came trotting into the clearing. It was Sheriff Miller, his face pale, his gun still in his holster. He looked at the bodies, the smoldering fire, and the two men in the dirt. He was too late to be a hero, but just in time to uphold the law. "Jackson," the sheriff said, his voice shaky, "what in God's name happened here?" Jackson looked at Harding, then at the sheriff. "Justice," he said. The aftermath was quiet. Sheriff Miller finally spurred into action by the undeniable carnage, arrested a gasping, wounded Cole Harding. He rounded up the few survivors of the posse who hadn't fled. The town of Prescott would have a lot to talk about, but the reign of Cole Harding was over. Cale helped Jackson tend to the dead. There was a grim efficiency to their work. They were soldiers, and this was the ugly arithmetic of war. When they were finished, Cale came to Jackson. "The map," he said, his voice low. Nellie emerged from the cabin. She was holding the wooden bird. She walked over to the body of one of Harding's men and retrieved the leather pouch from his pocket. She now held both halves of the map. She looked at Cale, then at the two pieces in her hands. "A map that leads to a sacred place should not be known by anyone," she said. She walked to the still smoldering embers of the fire she'd set. Without hesitation, she tossed both the wooden bird and the leather pouch into the glowing coals. They watched as the secrets of generations curled into ash and smoke. The silver of the spirits would remain with the spirits. Cale watched, a look of profound respect on his face. He nodded once to Nellie, a gesture of deep understanding. Then he turned to Jackson. "You fought with honor, Jackson Cole," he said. He placed a hand on his own chest. "If you or your family ever have need, my people will answer." With that, he turned, and as silently as he arrived, he disappeared back into the hills. Jackson walked onto the porch. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft colors, washing away the blood and violence of the day. Nellie came and stood beside him. She was bruised and sore, but she was alive. She was free. The screen door creaked open. Sarah stepped out, her face clean of the terror that had filled it just hours before. She walked over and stood between Jackson and Nayeli. She looked up at her father, her eyes clear. "She's family now," Sarah said, her voice soft but strong. She reached out and took Nayeli's hand. Then with her other hand, she took Jackson's. And there they stood, the three of them, a strange, broken little unit, bound together not by blood, but by fire and choice and courage. The silence that had haunted the ranch for 5 long years was finally, truly gone, replaced by something new, something that felt a lot like hope. They had faced the storm and survived. The house was still standing, and for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a home. Sometimes the biggest choices in our lives aren't made in a crowded room, but on a lonely riverbank under a hot, unforgiving sun. Jackson Cole was faced with a choice: ride on and keep his quiet, empty life, or stop and risk everything for a stranger. He chose to stop, and in doing so, he didn't just save a life. He saved his own. He saved his daughter. He found a family in the most unlikely of places. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What would you have done? When you see someone in trouble, someone the rest of the world has decided to ignore, do you ride on by, or do you stop? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Every choice we make, big or small, defines who we are. Stories like this remind us that courage isn't about the absence of fear. It's about acting in spite of it. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the story find more people who need to hear it. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next journey into the heart of the human spirit, be sure to subscribe. There's always another story waiting just over the ridge. Thanks for listening.